would love to introduce you all to John Thornton. John is a software venture capitalist who lives currently in Austin, Texas. He joined Austin Ventures in 1990 and served as the firm's managing partner from 2005 to 2008. In 2008, he co-founded the Texas Tribune, which is now the largest news organization in the United States focused on politics and policy at the state level, something that is obviously incredibly critical. In 2016, he co-founded Elsewhere Partners, which is a boutique venture capital firm in Austin. And in 2018, recognizing that there's an even greater need for funding and resources and all sorts of human capital resources, he co-founded the American Journalism Project, which is a venture philanthropy firm that invests in local nonprofit news. Welcome, John.
Thank you for having me.
So we'll just go ahead and jump right in if that's okay with you. Texas Tribune is a member-supported, digital-first, nonpartisan media organization that informs Texans and engages with, which is a critical piece of local news organizations, about public policy, politics, government, and statewide issues. You co-founded this in 2008 with Evan Smith and Ross Ramsey, who are two folks who are very well known in the Texas news space. Let's talk about those early days for those who are on, who care about entrepreneurship, which is my piece of the world here at the School of Management. How did you go from being a venture capitalist to launching one of the largest and frankly one of the earlier nonprofit news organizations in the country?
Sure. Well, first of all, I've never stopped being a venture capitalist. I'm not sure I can. I'm not sure I've got it in me.
We at the School of Management love to hear that because you can then fund some of our students.
The School of Management will understand then that the tale of the Texas Tribune begins as perhaps apropos of a venture capitalist begins as a tale of greed. Where I was serving as managing partner of our firm. We were trying to figure out our media investing strategy. This is 2007, 2008. We had been relatively media light to some of our peers, and we were just kind of checking in to make sure that if we were going to be contrarian, we were doing that on purpose and not on accident. And one of the categories of things that we sort of dipped our toe into, at least looking at, were digital startups around news. And this was about the time that the first distressed newspaper assets were coming on the market. And so we visited with a couple of those as well. The newspaper part, with the digital startup thing, we dismissed pretty quickly just because we don't understand at our firm, didn't understand advertising-based models really at all. The newspaper assets were a curiosity because they were complex and potentially economically interesting. We thought we spent a couple of, a week kind of futzing around the newspaper industry, and I remember this young associate who worked for us at the time saying, I don't get it. He said their pricing power has evaporated. They've got enormous fixed costs, and nobody under 30 cares about the product. He said, pass the bagels kind of thing. Why are we even here? And so the room full of smart young people clears out, at least figuratively, and leaves me with this kind of sinking feeling that, yeah, that's right. The economics here are just bad and they're going to get worse. And remember, this is pre-social media, pre-Facebook, pre-Twitter. But it felt to us like the writing was really, really on the wall, and that what was going to go missing was what we've come to call at the American Journalism Project civic news. And so me being a fairly rapacious capitalist in other places, thought, gosh, if this really does have the characteristics of a public good, i.e. the market's not going to make enough of it. Another way of saying that is, if this is a market failure, they're rare and worth paying attention to. And so it became sort of my obsession, and I'm an obsessive person, began to workshop the idea of really an experiment in nonprofit news, public service journalism, without really a target in mind. I happened to be in Texas, but that way, this wasn't about Texas. This was about the model. And but it happens that my friend Evan Smith was a member of that very loose focus group, and he said, you know, if you're going to do this, Texas at the state level is as good a place to start as any. And I said, well, that's great. Let's go do that. And he's like, are you effing kidding me? I've got the greatest job, but I'm not going anywhere. But he came around as the magazine business started to be a little bit less magazine-y, and the rest is kind of history. And he built the team and built the product and has executed at a really high level.
Excellent. I do remember I was working up at the time, and Finn Barnes from First Round Capital did the same thing. He kind of met with me to pick my brain about the news industry for a couple of hours, and I think First Round came to the same conclusion that you guys did, which was not a great place to put money if you're looking for a return on investment. That being said, it is a great place to put money if you are looking at society in general. So your overarching drive and I think thread for the past 10 years and the work that you've done is really this recognition of quality journalism and its importance in society. So can you just talk a little bit about how that's driving some of the work that you're doing?
Sure. And when we talk about this notion of quality journalism, I just want to put a pin in something that I think is particularly, maybe it's not needed, but it's timely, which is we've all got to do the kind of Men in Black thing and not think about national political coverage and not think about cable news shout fests and social media echo chambers. When we at AJP talk about quality journalism, it is inseparable from this notion of original reporting. And that's really the commodity that has gone missing. That is the sort of coin in the realm that we're trying to build a bank account back up through helping these organizations with their commercial and fundraising capabilities. But original reporting is really, as I said, the kind of the coin of the realm. We functionally think about quality journalism as having sort of three co-equal functions, which often overlap, and so it's sometimes hard to completely disaggregate them. But one is that quality journalism, and not everybody likes this word, but it protects us, it defends us, it helps keep us safe from exploitation. It's what we call accountability journalism, roundly holding to account powerful institutions, the people who run them. But it's also beat reporting. It's also reporting that has a prophylactic effect with these same institutions and the same powerful leaders. Our friend Steve Cole, who's the dean of the journalism school at Columbia, told me once that the Pulitzer Prize that should be awarded every year that never will be is for the story entitled something like "Nothing Terribly Shitty Happened at City Hall Today" because we were there. And he's right, it won't be, and it should, but that prophylactic function is super important. And sometimes we get really wrapped up in the importance of investigative journalism, which is doubtless true, but so is the beat reporting. The sort of second function of really high quality journalism is that it helps us determine what's in our interest and live our best lives in our communities. And so that's what we broadly refer to as service journalism. And then the third is a little more, I don't know, ineffable, maybe a little bit more controversial with hardcore journalism people, but I don't think it's ever been any more important. And that is that quality journalism helps foster a sense of community by listening to its audience, reflecting that audience back in its work, in its work. And there's a certain sort of convening and agenda setting function that has always been there, but organizations like CT Mirror, I think, are really discovering in a new and fresh way that makes it especially relevant to society. Because I think the really short answer is that quality journalism is kind of the lifeblood of an informed public, and you can't have a democracy that is liberal, representative, constitutional without a public that is informed, engaged, and participatory. And oh, by the way, you also need constant attention to human rights, free and fair elections, the rule of law. Journalism, we think, quality journalism undergirds all of that And we are fond of quoting Justice Brandeis, who said that the most important public office is that of private citizen. To really boil it down, we think that quality journalism just makes us better at our job as citizens. It makes us better able to do our job as citizens. And again, underlying that, the bedrock of that function is original reporting.
Yeah, so building off of a little bit of what you said, I do remember when I was doing that early research at CUNY, looking at the Texas Tribune, and one of the ways in which you really excelled was that convening factor and getting people to get together around the table and discuss these critical issues. Can you talk about the existing news ecosystem that existed when you were launching this in Texas? I know that there were other nonprofit news organizations around the country as well, such as New Haven Independent here in New Haven, that had been operating for a while. What lessons did you learn from these organizations that helped you kind of define and refine that early strategy at Texas Tribune?
Sure. I'll take those in the order you gave them. The existing news infrastructure in Texas was, and this is 2007, 2008, not surprisingly, largely dominated by newspapers. There were 5 big dailies in Texas, and obviously scores of smaller papers. It's probably worth a story just to give you a sense for how the industry has evolved. Evan and I ended up with the 5 editors of the major papers in a meeting. They happened to be at IRE in Austin. They were in our conference room. And Evan calls it the Easter Island meeting, because here were these 5 faces, just absolutely stony faced, no smiles, no nothing, would barely accept coffee or water, just sort of, shooting daggers through us with their eyes. And we had some conversations, some not very productive. One of the things that I was going to raise with these gentlemen at the time was the notion that maybe we would provide state level coverage that they were having a hard time affording, and they could pay us just a little bit of money. And I just read the room and kind of stopped myself in mid sentence and thought back to the spreadsheet, thought, okay, that goes to 0. And just sort of made the executive decision to kind of pitch the idea of them getting this coverage for free. And one of the editors who remains a friend says to me, well, it's not really free because we've still got to pay for the newsprint. At which point I apparently said, yeah, Bob, we're not going to pay for your goddamn newsprint. And apparently the meeting ended there. Perhaps not my finest moment. But the point is that at that time, this notion of a collaborative ecosystem was non-existent, right? I mean, competition, absolutely the name of the game in local journalism. Fast forward to today, you see in major journalism awards, it's more common than not to have not only collaboration, but collaboration between for-profit and nonprofit entities. And with regard to the Tribune, they've gone from being sort of persona non grata to there was a Sunday not too terribly long ago where both Dallas and Houston newspapers owned by different owners ran the same Tribune story on A1 on Sunday. And so it's evolved an awful lot. In terms of what we learned from other organizations, I mean, it was the field of nonprofit journalism was so nascent at the time. We're really kind of standing on the shoulders of the early work done by guys like Chuck Lewis when he founded the Center for Public Integrity in the 80s, the early pioneers of public media. And so we were all kind of groping around learning from each other. But the one thing that kind of jumped out all the time was the real precarity of all of our existence. And I think precarity is maybe the odds-on favorite for the word of the year in 2020, but we really felt it deeply then. And we had in our midst this thing called ProPublica, which has become a obviously can't fail national treasure institution that Paul Steiger and Dick Toffel have led that thing marvelously, but they also had the advantage of starting with a substantial runway. In their case, I think it was $30 million. And so I think the lesson that we continue to take away is you can't do this super on the cheap. you've got to build capacity from the get-go. You've got to produce, you've got to build revenue generating capacity from the get-go. I'm a software investor, and I always say that none of our software companies have ever sold any software if they don't have software salespeople, right? It just doesn't, people don't just walk up and knock on your door. Same here. And so I think what we learned in that process was the importance of investing in business and fundraising capacity alongside editorial in the very beginnings.
Yes, you need to invest in that side if you want to be able to have the reporters feed their families. So
there's that. There's that.
So
I think the other thing we and maybe we can talk about this later, but I think it was. I mean, it was an odd time, still an odd time, but it was an odd time in the sense that we were all sort of almost apologetic about our nonprofit status, if you know what I mean. It's sort of like real men didn't do nonprofit kind of thing. And so I think we were all a little sheepish about saying, hey, look, we don't think the emperor has any clothes here, and we don't think this model is going to get any better, and we don't think that this is just a particularly deep recession. This is a real watershed moment for our society. And that was, it was nice to have fellow travelers, but there weren't very many of us.
Yeah. So here at the School of Management, we love to explore both success and failure, particularly with early stage founders. And I know we have some students here who are listening. And so can you give me a sense of those early days, first couple of years, you're trying to get off the ground, looking back, what do you think that you got right? And what do you think that you got very wrong?
Well, I mean, we got, and here I want to shift pronouns because it's really the founding team, got the product and the general strategy ridiculously right, given that we didn't do a scintilla of market research. I mean, this was really kind of sprung fully formed from the head of Zeus, also known as Evan Smith. And in some ways, I think we were really lucky. In some ways, I think his and his team's instincts were just so great and that they produced a really good product. What we didn't do so well, I guess you could look at it one of two ways. We either didn't raise enough money to begin with, or we spent it too fast. In either case, we damn near ran out. And just continue to learn the lesson that just like anything else in a startup, it's going to take longer. It's going to cost a little more. You're going to make mistakes. You can't price the thing for perfection. You're going to make hiring mistakes. All those things that as a startup investor, I just know instinctively. I think I still misjudged the degree to which we were going to need cushion and runway, and so we had, like many or most startups, a near-death experience, which we pulled out of, and the team pulled out of, and really learned to, as Evan says, hug the mission and pinch the pennies, which they've done subsequently. Evan and I spent 8 years fighting like an old married couple. Fortunately, there's no sex or kids involved, and so it was always about money. We've through experimentation, I think, come to just really deeply ingrain this notion of, one, you've got to have revenue diversification, but two, you just got to get good with the fact that philanthropy is going to have to be a major component of these things, revenue stack in perpetuity. Yeah,
so let's switch a little bit to kind of the folks who are on the other side of the table who maybe didn't take that path. I think if you look over the past 15 years, we've seen how private equity investments into the news have gone pretty awry, so to speak. So Fortress Investment Group took over Liberty Publishing in 2005 to create the future news media Gatehouse. They went on to acquire 600 newspapers and have since closed 100, according to UNC's News Desert Project. And I think you're seeing that across the country with Alden Capital and Digital First Media, Civitas and Versa. So why do you think so much private equity actually, I mean, I remember digging into the economics of the New Haven Register and that entire group when I was a student at the School of Management. Why do you think so much private equity flowed into the industry? And what do you think the overall impact has been on the news, local news in particular?
Well, the newspaper business is nothing special from a business standpoint, right? And the associate who I referred to earlier kind of had it right? I mean, the top line shrinking, you can't really move the expense structure that much. The long-term product roadmap is not that hot. So what do? You cut expenses, right? And and especially, I mean, one of the underlying factors here is we've all got to remember that the cost of capital, the cost of debt during this period has been essentially
Crazy.
right. And so it's a pretty standard playbook among private equity firms to lever up to get returns on their equity. If you can't do that by top line growth, you do it by cutting expenses. And by far the largest non-fixed expense in a newspaper is the newsroom and the people in the newsroom and the original reporting that I talked about at the jump being the really scarce resource. And so I don't, and maybe partly because I'm tangentially at least part of the species, I don't really, I don't begrudge these folks their opportunity, if you will, to make money for their investors. That's what they do. I mean, that's, a duck swims, and private equity folks try to return 18% a year for their investors, and that's their function in society. Where things got cattywampus was a long time ago, in arguably as early as the late 60s, when the first newspaper companies or newspaper chains became public companies, and you had this real divergence of economic interest and public service interest. Public service had always been a kind of implied obligation of newspapers. Some publishers took it more seriously than others, but the economic imperative became the explicit imperative. And once you're a fiduciary, where corporate law is pretty clear about to whom you own your allegiance, and it ain't the community, it's your shareholders. What we've seen play out in the last couple of years, we think, is really just a logical extension of something that started a half century ago or even more.
Excellent, thank you. So you launched American Journalism Project, and in response to this increasingly perilous outlook, I think, for local news organizations, you've since raised $39 million towards your first fund, $10 million.
39.6 or 7.
Excellent. 10 million towards your second one. That matters. Can you tell us a little bit more about the organization and the vision that you and Elizabeth Green, your co-founder, had when you launched this to support local news?
Sure. So Elizabeth Green, the founder and CEO of Chalkbeat, and I were introduced by a mutual friend, because we had actually Peter Lattman at the Emerson Collective, and then Jennifer Preston at the Knight Foundation, because we had talked to them about a very similar idea. As it turned out, down to the spreadsheet level, we were thinking about the same things, coming from really, really different directions. Elizabeth being 20 years younger than I, career journalist, entrepreneurial force of nature. What she was really looking for was a peer group, right, and a community, and a way to learn. What I was thinking about was just the real challenge of capital formation in the knowledge creation business, given that the air had come out of the advertising model. Subscription model has never been something that pays for news really to any substantial degree. And so I think we both were kind of kindred spirits in the sense that we weren't exactly sure how long-term capital formation is going to work in the news business, but in the short term, it was the market had certainly vetoed that. I joke, and it's not very funny, but being an early stage venture capitalist, I know that my brethren and sistren will fund damn near anything, but not this.
I even wished that was patently true.
Yeah, no, it's not this, because it's just like, well, again, go back to the associate in the conference room. You could, but why would you, right? And so this is really just kind of, all right, if you think about public media in the 50s and early 60s, but before the passage of the Public Broadcasting Act in 1968, it was philanthropy, particularly the Ford Foundation and some others, that kind of stepped into the breach and said, okay, we got to rethink the way we do this. And like a lot of great philanthropies, we've got to highlight solutions until the public and public policy catches up with this notion that there is a difference between the public interest and, as Newton Minow famously said, what interests the public. They're not the same thing in a constitutional, liberal, representative democracy. And so that our vision was an enterprise that would begin to stand up some examples of such organizations and really, really work on what is the continuously arduous task of growing the field of journalism philanthropy. And it's getting, it's punctuated equilibrium. It's getting better, but that's always the kind of at the core of the mission, is to grow that pie.
So venture philanthropy to you then is a much better model for funding the news than private equity and private capital.
Well, private equity doesn't fund the news. Private equity just owns it, right? And venture capital is not going to fund it. We are hopefully about to have, sometime in the not too distant future, a robust conversation in the society about our priorities and about whether, in our view, it's not even whether, it's when we begin to view these knowledge provisioning institutions as civic rather than commercial, and the public treasury gets involved in some way, and we shift our priorities as society. That ain't gonna happen tomorrow. The acceleration of the information crisis that was already declining at a way steep enough rate, the acceleration of that with the public health crisis has just underlined the urgency of this, we think, even more.
Great. So when you look across news organizations, and when I was doing my research, I reached out to probably 100 local news sites and talked to all the individuals who had started those sites. You do notice, and this is very true, I think, when you started Texas Tribune, that each community has its unique needs. So you can't really create this blanket product that's going to serve all the needs of the local communities, because there's just distinct needs in each community. So research has shown that it's important to operate news organizations, or for news organizations to operate within their own local context. That being said, there are some similarities in which the ways the organizations run. And I think part of what you're trying to do with AJP is really to find those commonalities. Can you talk about what you're seeing when you look across these geographies, where those commonalities are, and what resources you are putting towards addressing these common needs in a way that's a little bit more scalable than each individual operator trying to do it on their own?
Right. And that's at least a chapter of a book, if not a whole book, but I'll try to do the very short version. And it's a real time. Sarah Beth will tell you that how we come at the answer to that question is a moving target. It is the subject of both much debate and much experimentation. And as I alluded to, has been that debate and experimentation has become more sort of fraught and more urgent as we enter what we call the post-newspaper world. And you're no longer talking about filling in coverage gaps, because there's no coverage, so there's no gaps, right? So it's, you're kind of it, and that has implications for cost structure, across communities in communities of different size, how those costs get shared, how the revenue production strategy works when you're now trying to stand up an ecosystem as opposed to stand up an individual organization. But certainly the chains they weren't all wrong, right? They centralized a bunch of business functions. We are directionally encouraging that. We're not smart enough to, nor do we want to play God, but we are trying to shape the income statement of these things every bit as much as we are the editorial coverage, because if you don't do the former, the latter is just not going to follow. And so the business needs, at least our hypothesis evolving into thesis, is that the business needs are fairly common across the communities. The coverage needs are different. There's no doubt about that, and that's why we think this third function, protecting, serving, and we don't know what to call it yet, listening, convening, engaging, you name it, but this notion that there is a real dynamic feedback loop, and it's not the stentorian newspaper of record. That's just really, really important to this new way of thinking about these things in civic institutions. It's important to broadening the pool of support that thinks about it in that way. And so, I don't know. There are a lot of questions in the one that you asked, but what we're really trying to do is bring business principles to a business that just stinks, as well as a public service mentality and a civic good and a public interest mentality. Other than that, it's real easy.
Excellent. So I want to ask you one more question before we bring Bruce and Sarah Beth into the conversation. Institute for Nonprofit News is this organization that supports and convenes nonprofit news organizations. There are over 200 now in the US, and I suspect many of them are looking at AGP now for support. What makes you and the AGP team want to invest your money and your time in a local, what you're calling civic news organization?
Again, complex answer. It always starts with the people. It always starts with people. We are not for the most part, and we can talk about this in our startup practice. That's a little bit different if somebody wants to, but for the most part, we're following great people and going to places where we think we can scratch together some money. We don't have a kind of 60,000 foot view where we say, news desert there, news desert there, news desert there. In the fullness of time and with the capital available, that'd be great. But what we're trying to do now is stand up things that are truly exemplary. That starts with great people. What's a little different than the business strategy or the investment strategy that we originally conceived was, and this goes back to your question about shared resources. When this was a glimmer in Elizabeth's and my eye, I think we thought that with the first fund, we could help stand up 15 or 20 or 25 of these as kind of lighthouses that didn't necessarily talk to each other all that much, and just that we could learn from. Yep. We're afraid we don't have, and it was going to be the next person's problem to solve how all this fits together, i.e. Sarah Beth. We don't think we have that luxury now. So all that is a long way of setting up to say that we are looking to make grants to organizations that are interested in really growing their capabilities to serve a broader community, both in terms of boots on the ground coverage and in terms of the capabilities that they can help enable in other places. And so I use the sports analogy that we in a lot of places we're figuring out how to go from man-to-man defense to zone defense, right? Because and where to apply resources in a way that you just can't follow the old newspaper model. You've got to figure out what the really critical information needs are in the community and go there. So again, probably sounds like kind of a non-answer, but we're looking for super entrepreneurial, super scrappy people that have a reasonable, ambitious plan to serve an ever-expanding community of news consumers.
Excellent. That reminds me a lot of the groups that exist in our world, the Techstars and the Y Combinators, where it's about the capital, but it's just as much about the community as well. So to that end, let's switch gears and bring Bruce and Sarah Beth into the conversation. And as they are joining, I will go ahead and tell you a little bit about each of them. I also forgot to say I am Jennifer McFadden, Associate Director of Entrepreneurial Programs here at the School of Management, and I teach students how to start companies. Should have said that at the beginning. Sarah Beth Berman, CEO of the American Journalism Project. Previously, she was Global Head of Affairs, Public Affairs at Teach for All, which I think she'll explain why is critical to this role, where she led communications and marketing, public sector partnerships, and research and evaluation. Before joining Teach for All, Sarah Beth spent 7 years in China, where she led fundraising and recruitment for Teach for China. She first came to China in 2007 as a Henry Luce Scholar, working as a producer and manager in the performing arts. In addition to her work at AJP, she serves on the board of directors at the Mark Morris Dance Group and lives with her husband and kids in DC. Bruce Putterman joined the Connecticut Mirror, which is this incredible nonprofit news organization serving the Connecticut community, as publisher and CEO in April 2017. Before joining the Connecticut Mirror, he owned and operated a West Hartford community-based consulting practice for 16 years and provided strategic planning and marketing consulting services to more than 50 nonprofit organizations. His interest in journalism dates back to his college years when he worked in commercial radio and TV news. In addition to his work at Connecticut Mirror, he has served as an elected member of the West Hartford Board of Education and chaired that board for 3 years. So I think both of you have this incredible nonprofit experience that is so helpful to the business side of what we're going to start talking about. So welcome to both of you. Sarah Beth, we will start with you. As we started talking about, AGP focuses on these 3 core functions: financial investments, venture support, and movement building. Can you talk about these 3 things and how each of them are interrelated?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Jennifer. I'm realizing that the sun went down as this conversation was going, and my room is now very moody because I don't have the overhead light on, but hopefully will add to the effect. AJP is using a venture philanthropy model. So we're investing in organizations, as John mentioned. We're investing on the business side, so helping these organizations beef up their staff, that's fundraising, that's building membership, that's thinking about the marketing, that's thinking about the business operations. But we're pairing that with really hands-on capacity building support and building a community amongst these organizations. So it's no longer just about Connecticut, but really joining a movement of organizations across the country that care about the future of local news. And lastly, we just really feel like we have a role to play in leading this philanthropic movement. We know that to build the future of local news, philanthropy is going to have to be at the heart of the revenue model. It's not going to be all of the revenue model, but it needs to play a really important role. And so we're doing our part to really make the case for the fact that we need philanthropists, large and small, to prioritize this. And so we're thinking about that through national fundraising, through supporting our grantees to do local fundraising, and then also through storytelling. Journalists are really good at telling other people's stories. They're not very good at telling their own story and why they're having an impact. So we're helping them do that.
Excellent. Thank you. So Bruce, the Connecticut Mirror launched in 2009. You were not quite there yet, but they did launch with $1.8 million in seed funding. Can you talk a little bit about how the organization has evolved since that time and maybe evolved since you started back in 2017?
Sure. Yeah. And thanks everybody for being on the panel tonight, and thank you for everybody who's attending. So, kind of to John's point about the Texas Tribune starting out as an experiment, the Connecticut Mirror also, as I understand it, so this is all hearsay, folklore. The Mirror started out very consciously as a 3-year experiment with funding for 3 years, and the idea was, as I understand it, if it works, great, we'll take it from there. And if it doesn't work, we gave it the old college try. The reason it was founded was to fill the void in state public policy and in holding government accountable, particularly in light of kind of the continued erosion and a particularly precipitating event of a major layoff at the Hartford Courant in the late 2000s during the midst of the recession. When the Mirror first published in January 2010, there were 3 reporters, an editor, and a publisher. I think technically there were 2 reporters, and the first 2 like to say the third one didn't come along until 4 weeks later. But in any event, today we have 7 reporters, a photojournalist, a data journalist, a multi-platform journalist, 2 regular contributors, and 2 editors. So we've grown considerably since those early days. I think it's safe to say the experiment, it's obviously always a work in progress, but it's worked, at least for the first 10 and a half years. And the cherry on top is we do have plans to hire 3 additional people by the early next year sometime. On the business side, so a lot of the early investment and really the investment through just a year or 2 ago was in the journalism. Incremental dollars, marginal dollars were going into more journalism. And the publisher role essentially was largely everything else: revenue generation, operations, finance, HR. And thanks to AJP, we were able to hire 2 people onto the business team. We just hired a director of leadership giving. She started a week ago, and she's already got some great ideas for us. So we're very excited about that. And actually, back in January, we hired. We made the first hire of the entire cohort in this grant cycle. Kyle Constable, who many of the folks who are attending tonight will recognize his name. We hired him as our manager of membership and audience development. So that's kind of broad summary of the evolution. I guess I'll just add that on the coverage side, initially I'm told that we were kind of perceived very much as for the policymakers and the lobbyists and the advocates, and there was even a running joke that persisted to the time that I joined the Mirror that our target audience was 06106, which is the zip code for the state capital. Today, we have a vastly expanded readership. We still probably have more readers in Hartford than other parts of the state, but we reach all parts of the state. New Haven counties and Fairfield counties are right behind Hartford County. And we do have an interest in expanding our coverage, particularly in Fairfield County, which oftentimes is viewed by people in Hartford as the ATM for Connecticut, is viewed by people in Fairfield County, where I actually grew up. I grew up in Stamford. It's viewed by people in Fairfield County as really, the old joke is they think their governor lives in Albany and not in Hartford. So the goal is to create more of a sense of community, statewide community, which is kind of hard to come by sometimes in Connecticut. It kind of stops at the Housatonic River. Like any startup, we did a lot of experimenting, and really experimentation continues to be the ethos of what drives us. So we'll keep doing that, even as we go to reach a higher scale. So we'll continue to experiment as audience needs and the media landscape and financial models and everything else continue to change.
Great. So building off of that a little bit, and this idea that there are all of these disparate areas of the state of Connecticut, there also are a lot of different nonprofit and for-profit existing media organizations in this state. Can you talk about how you collaborate with these organizations and maybe provide a specific example and how that makes the entire state of Connecticut better off?
So I think the most obvious and regular and ongoing form of collaboration is that the top 12 daily newspapers in the state, and Connecticut, it's kind of to John's point earlier, there aren't really news deserts in Connecticut there the way there are in other parts of the country. There are daily newspapers that are publishing, but they're getting thinner and thinner all the time. The top 12 daily newspapers in the state purchase content from us. So if you live down in Westport or out in New London and you pick up your local paper, you will fairly often see a Connecticut Mirror byline. And so they are our customers, they are our collaborators. John mentioned Evan Smith before. One thing that Evan says, I gather, I've heard him say it a couple of times, is there's no such thing as competitors. There's only current and future collaborators. And when I heard him say that, I blew that up 8.5 by 11, put it on my bulletin board, and I look at that every day. And that kind of collaboration is critical to me to extending resources in a sector where resources are scarce. Other ways in which we collaborate are, so we are a tenant in the Connecticut Public Broadcasting Building. That's where I'm sitting right now. They are extremely generous to us. We pay a 3-figure rent, which is unheard of, and even in downtown Hartford. We're on their air a lot, talking about various topics. We publish some of their content. They publish some of our content. During COVID, we split doing the story of the day during COVID. The governor had a press conference every day. That was the story of the day. So on alternating days, we would cover, they would cover, we would cover, they would cover. And that basically freed each organization that wasn't doing story of the day. It provided one extra reporter for that organization to go out and do a different story during COVID. So that extended our resources. And perhaps the project that I'm most proud of is that we, through a solutions journalism grant, we were able to convene 5 other news organizations and a documentary film company based in New Haven called Purple States around a joint project focusing, it was called the Cities Project, and it focused on how to revitalize Connecticut's cities, many of whose glory days were in the past, and then hopefully in the future. And through that collaboration, we published 40 different items, from in-depth stories to sidebars to video to photo galleries, and even an event at the Arts and Ideas Festival in New Haven. So that was a great, we got more of a sense of the real outcome, the real win in that project was trust building. The journalism was terrific, but the trust building was great, and hopefully, sets the table for the next kind of collaborative project like that.
I think within the School of Management, Barry Nailbuff would classify all of this as co-opetition. So that is a big economic premise. So John, going back to American Journalism Project for a minute, you gave one of the first grants with AJP to Connecticut Mirror last December, and you put some pretty stringent conditions on them in exchange for the funding. Can you talk a little bit about what made you decide to fund Bruce in the first place and his team, and then talk a little bit about what they have to give in exchange for that funding?
Oh, for heaven's sake, just look at the guy. What more do you need? I think the appeal to us was that here was a guy and here was a team who was, as we said at the outset, really dedicated to expanding their capabilities, expanding their capacity to serve more and more of the landscape. And I think that the conditions that I don't think we were that onerous. I mean, we by design agree sort of upfront with the team what team members we're funding to add. That's what we do over the course of what will ultimately be a $50 million fund. We hope to grow the number of business people and fundraising people in the nonprofit news segment by something like a quarter to a third, right? Because I mean, that's both the kind of ambitious good news and kind of bad news is we're way short on that side. And so what Bruce brought particularly was an orientation toward the business. We're really, really excited about people coming into the field from not journalism, from other, other walks of life on the commercial side. And so it was just really kind of I think, a pleasant convergence of the ambition of the institution that is now 10 years old and this very new institution that is AJP.
Great. And Sarah Beth, from an investment perspective, when you're looking at these new news organizations that you're trying to serve, or the existing ones that the community news organizations, as you're calling them, what do you want to see in terms of a revenue mix from the organizations that you are funding?
Yeah, I mean, we're less focused on exactly what the revenue mix looks like coming in, and much more focused on who's in the leadership and what are the ambitions, where is this organization headed, and then coming alongside them to really ramp up that revenue pie. And the mix over time, we see it playing out sort of over and over, which is a mix of major gifts, foundations, reader revenue, sponsorships and commercial revenue, sort of more traditional commercial revenue, and other revenue like events. So we're working alongside a really excellent team to build that revenue pie based on the kind of compelling mission that they can make to their community.
Okay, great. We do have a couple of questions from the audience, so I do want to give a second to answer or to ask these questions. First question is from Diana Jepson, and she asked, with the decline in funding a number of college media outlets, newspapers, is there any interest in trying to fund college news either independently or ensuring that your local news organizations are partnering with colleges to get those student voices heard? And any of you can answer these. Sarah Beth, you can start if you'd like.
Well, I'd be interested in if Bruce, if you guys are doing any collaborations locally. I mean, we see the same story playing out, whether it's ethnic media, the Black press. This same story is playing out, local media, college media, where the market dynamics are leaving these organizations in very, very difficult straits. So I think we really do need to figure out how we support college media, college journalists, and has always historically been such an important pipeline of talent into local news and then eventually national news. So it's a really important issue. We should figure out what to do about it. Yeah. Bruce, have you guys done any collaborations with college media?
Yeah, we have. So first of all, we have a UConn journalism professor on our board, and we have another UConn journalism adjunct on our board as well. We did a really nice collaboration last summer between the Emma Bowen Foundation, which places in college interns of color in news organization, in media in general, I guess, some of whom can elect to go into journalism. So between them and us and the Yale Journalism Initiative. And so all three of us came together to fund a young woman, actually, John, who lives in Austin. And she is a Yale student. We never met her. She reported from Austin all summer about things going on throughout Connecticut. In any event, so we've done that. We've had UConn interns. We just started something really interesting just this week. Trinity College has a public policy course, and the professor of that public policy course, we offered to her to have her students publish their kind of seminal end of or middle of term paper around the topic. They were doing a topic related to privatization, the intersection of privatization and government, quasi-government private public partnership type stuff. So we offered to publish those as viewpoints, that's our opinion section. And so we branded it, and we're creating a landing page for it, and we're trying to create some excitement, and then we hope to shop that to other colleges and universities in the state.
Great. So one more question, and maybe I'll throw this to you, John, first. So far we've discussed, this is from Bill Flood. So far you've discussed this mostly in terms of print and online journalism. Is there a model for local broadcast journalism where a number of people still get most of their coverage? How can we bring the concept of public good to local broadcast journalism?
Yeah, it's a good question and a fascinating one. I mean, I think the broadcast news is arguably, and it depends on how you slice it, but it's still where the plurality of people receive or where they go for their primary news source. What broadcast journalism at the local level typically does not do a ton of is original reporting, right? They are very much a distribution channel for, not just a distribution channel, but they use a lot of raw material that has come out of other newsrooms and traditionally newspapers. I must say that one of my if I ever get to come back and do kind of some of this stuff in parallel, in the same way that zillionaires had bought papers, which they mainly regretted, I'd love to buy a broadcast station and run it in the public interest and see what happens. I think the problem with that is those are still healthy enough businesses that you can't, the entry price is just pretty high. But what we are dealing with in a parallel way is how do we enable public broadcasting to do the very real work that it traditionally has thought of as kind of a secondary priority, because the commercial institutions kind of had the news gathering covered. And so one of the big meaty issues on the table is how do you take the reach, the distribution reach of broadcast and infuse it with this original reporting news DNA that is present in some places and less present in others. But that's something that I know Sarah Beth and team are really thinking about.
Right, Sarah Beth, maybe you want to chime in a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I'll echo what John said, which is that the reason why we're so focused on the decline of newspapers is that has been historically, and frankly still is in its very meager state, the source of original reporting. So you think about when you're listening to broadcast TV, they start by saying, you know, as reported in the Sacramento Bee, blah, 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 blah happened. Like that is where where they're getting the original reporting. And so that's why our focus has been on this problem of the decline of original reporting. And then our perspective on how it's delivered is that we're delivery agnostic. Like we need this information to get to communities. That should happen through digital websites. It should happen through there's a new organization in New York City called Documented that's using WhatsApp in really fascinating ways to reach huge communities. So delivery agnostic, what we're very passionate about is original reporting. You're on mute, Jennifer.
All right, thank you. Maybe you or John can address this question. We have a question from Mark Merco, who is also a reader. He wants you to talk about the difference between venture capitalism and venture philanthropy, especially as it relates to owning of journalistic enterprises. So Connecticut's Hartford Courant is only one case, obviously, of newspapers decimated by private equity, as we talked about earlier. Can you just talk about the differences between the two models and expectations as it relates to return on investment?
I can start, but John knows venture capital very well. I mean, the biggest difference is that our return on investment is a return on societal investment. We are making grants. We are not expecting a return financially. We are expecting that our investment will deliver more revenue back to the organization. So we're committed, in our case, to 2 to 3x the annual investment we make coming back to CT Mirror by them hiring these fabulous new hires that are helping them build their revenue pie. But the return on investment is one that we think Connecticut will be better served, and the country will be better served by investing in these organizations. So that's a really fundamental difference, where we're taking the kind of positives of what VC does is really just like getting behind these companies. We got their back. We're investing money, dollars, but we're also really investing resources. And that's what VC has done so well, which is finding companies, people, leaders they believe in, and then getting them the resources, the connections, the insights, the strategies to help them succeed. And so we're taking the best of that and trying to apply it to venture philanthropy. John, do you have further thoughts on that?
No, I mean, it's you said it. We're trying to take, and we're learning as we go, right? We certainly didn't invent venture philanthropy. It's a notion that's been around for more than a generation. We're trying to port it to this sphere, and we unfortunately, I guess, believe that, again, from a capital formation standpoint, it's got to be philanthropic capital that kind of primes the pump, but we want to build as aggressive and sophisticated commercial capabilities as we can alongside to take the burden off of philanthropy. So we're trying to get the best of both worlds.
Great. Well, we have officially hit 6:30, but I will ask you each one last question, and those who need to drop off can drop off. What do you see as the future of local news, and what makes each of you optimistic that there is going to be a future for local news? Bruce, maybe we'll start with you.
Well, what makes me optimistic that there will be a future for local news is that people want local news. People want news about their towns, about their communities. So there'll always be a demand for that. And hopefully, maybe ebbing and flowing, but that ultimately some new level of experimentation leads to some new model that provides that local news. What's so exciting about the work that we're doing now, as John mentioned and Sarah Beth, I mean, just everybody's experimenting. There is no model. Everything's fair game, and as long as people kind of are willing to innovate and willing to learn from their innovation and learn from their mistakes when they innovate, we can only better serve audiences and communities. And I will just say this, so in Connecticut, we have a number of hyperlocals. There's at least a dozen towns right now that I'm aware of where somebody for no money or very little money is sitting in his or her basement writing stories after covering a Board of Education meeting because they believe in their community. And that's just remarkable. And a maybe kissing cousin to that is this notion of citizen reporters. So organizations, and one of those is in the cohort, and maybe Sarah Beth or John could talk about that, but where news professionals are training citizens to go out and report like journalists. And they do it for free or for a stipend. But it's this, in Chicago, they have an army of citizen reporters who go out and cover a community or a neighborhood. And I see that potentially as an important model throughout the country.
Great. Sarah Beth, what makes you optimistic about the future?
Well, those on this call who are loyal CT Mirror readers will know this, but last month they covered a story on the Connecticut COVID rental relief program that had been going for 6 months and found that 2 people had received funding, just 2. And then a week later, they revamped the entire program as a result of that reporting. Like the fact that that's happening gives me a lot of optimism. And I think that people are ready to step up and say, we need to know what's going on in our communities and we're going to support this. And we're seeing that momentum growing. So I'm feeling really optimistic about that.
Excellent. And lastly, John.
I think we're at the precipice of our society coming to grips with the fact that these have got to be civic institutions, and that's it's the work of a lifetime, quite frankly, and it's one that we deeply believe in. But that is the kind of root mentality that is going to have to take hold in American society to make all this work, and how we're going to see that play out is in both breadth and depth of support. And we see it in membership growth. We're super excited about what's going on at the kind of, Bernie Sanders $27 a year level, but we also need big philanthropy to come into this field in the way, again, that they did in public media in the 50s and 60s. The great news is there's a whole lot of money on the sideline that is dedicated to giving itself away in the lifetime of its producer, and we just got to continue to put this on the radar as a super worthy cause, and we really believe it is.
Excellent. Well, I want to thank all of you for your time. I really appreciate it. We had intended to do this in person, and it would have been awesome to do it in person so I could have the chance to chat more with each of you, and people in the audience could chat more with each of you. And I know going forward, we're going to try to do that optimistically. But thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to seeing how all of this evolves over the course of the next year.
Great, thanks so much.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, everybody.
Excellent.